everybody. I'm Marianne Mohenraj behind the camera, and I'm here for the Speculative Literature Foundation interviewing my former teacher from Clarion, Nicola Griffith. Nicola is well known for many of her works. Her early books, Ammonite and Slow River, I would say were groundbreaking queer texts in the science fiction fantasy field. Just generally, in fact, groundbreaking. But today we're going to talk about some of her more recent work. We're going to talk about Hild and So Lucky and her new book, Spear, which is coming out in April 2022. So starting with Hild. So Hild is set in the 7th century, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. And I did read this a few years ago, so correct me if I get things wrong. I had a few questions about the book, which I would say for anyone who hasn't read it, it is the story of a young girl who is growing up and being sort of cultivated, trained to be a seer. Is that fair? Is that
kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe if you have like a 1 or 2 line description, that might be a better starting point.
It begins with the young child. She's called Hild. She's 3 years old, mm-hmm. and begins in a wood, and then she finds out her father has died. It turns out her father is basically the Atheling, the next in line mm-hmm. for the throne, but he's in exile because mm-hmm. the country is just at war, and he's just been poisoned. And so suddenly Hild, her mother, and her sister are in pretty deep shit. Right. They are going to be hounded and pursued, and so they have to immediately make friends with powerful people. Mm. And so Hild's mother trains her to appear to be a seer. Yeah. Hild really is just very smart and very observant, right, and very politically astute. Yeah. And she uses her observations to make what seem like predictions.
Yeah, I think, and I almost feel like if this book were just coming out, I would have said, "Don't." This was a really fascinating kind of slow reveal as you're working through the book. So I hope we haven't spoiled it for anyone. I don't think so, because even though Hild is in a sort of very tense situation at the start of the book, the stakes are clearly really high. I think part of what makes this book so remarkable is the pacing of it, and that it's you build this world in tremendous detail with such an immersion in nature and the environment that I think that's perhaps the thing I found most unusual about the book. So and I think in genre fiction we often have such a focus on pacing, such a sort of commercial sense of, oh, you must keep the eyeball kicks coming, you have to like have something dramatic happening on every page so the reader keeps turning the pages. I never wanted to stop turning pages, right? So even though in some sense the pacing was very slow. So could you talk a little about sort of how you decided to write the book in this way, and that pacing in particular, and maybe the sense of nature and immersion?
Yes, I did a lot of research for this book, mainly because I fell in love with the notion of the 7th century and trying to figure out who Hild was, how Hild could be, how in what was used to be called the Dark Ages, and people have this vision of the Dark Ages as very primitive, where might was right, and women were basically chattels and or rape toys. They were just playthings of powerful men. Mm. And yet there's an abbey in the north of England that Hild founded in the 7th century, and she's still known for that. So those two pictures of this era, they just didn't fit together. Mm-hmm. And so I had to figure out how this woman could become who she became, how she could become so powerful that even 1400 years later, right, she was well known. And I wasn't sure how to do that. And so what I had to do was all the research, flora, fauna, building techniques, jewelry, clothes, textile work, etc. And I used all that to essentially build the 7th century.
Yeah.
And then I put Hild in it and watched how she reacted to it and how she grew. And I basically learnt through Hild how to tell the story. And I always begin with nature. I love nature, and setting it's my primary joy as a writer. And how detailed do you want me to get?
As much as you like.
Okay. What my work basically does, and Hild in particular, is I call it norming the other.
Okay.
And I do that through creating narrative empathy. And I do that using focalized heterotopia, which is, that is to say, to take my focalizing character and create a world for them that is a heterotopia for them. So, for example, Hild is queer, but she never, ever has any stress, harassment, punishment for being queer. So for her, from the queer perspective, it's a heterotopia.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I actually wrote my PhD thesis on this. I can send you a copy.
I'd love to see a copy.
So nature is a big part of that, because one of the ways to create empathy is to essentially immerse the reader inside this character, except it's actually the other way around. What I do is I get the reader to create the character inside them, so that they are living the character's life. They feel what the character feels, they see what she sees, they smell what she smells. Because there are some basic human emotions, things like fear, lust, excitement, disgust, that are common to all people everywhere. And so if you can get the reader to feel those things, you are bringing them closer to the character. And so I use nature to do that. I put Hild in this place, and it helps also the reader understand how the world works, because a child is learning how her own world works, the way all children do. So it was necessarily a kind of stateliness. And it was easy for me to do that with this book, because it was not a genre book. I mean, it's published as a literary novel by a big literary press, and the rules are slightly different.
That's right.
And as it was, they actually crunched down the apparent page count. I mean, they didn't crunch down the amount of words, but they used thinner paper and smaller typesetting, because they were terrified of it looking like a big fat fantasy book.
Sure.
Because there is actually no fantasy in it, even though it really feels like it's fantastic.
It does feel fantastical, right? And I think partly it's part of the feel is the the sort of ways in which she convinces people she's a seer, but I think more than that, you know, a lot of the joy that people get out of reading fantasy and science fiction often has to do with the world building, with being taken to a different place, and immersed in it, and that comes across so strongly here, right? So it's really effective, I think. So.
Thank you. And I loved it. I loved writing that book. I had the best time.
I think people have generally loved reading it, so I think my friends all rave about it as well. Okay, I want to cover so much in 45 minutes. We may touch on Hild again, but let me and just to remind myself, the real life person she was based on, who I gather we know almost nothing about her actual life, is Saint Hildegard.
Saint Hilda of Whitby.
Saint Hilda of Whitby. Who's different from Saint Hildegard von Bingen, right?
For several hundred years.
Yes, right. Okay, Saint Hilda of Whitby. So I just wanted to clarify that. I was like, I don't think that's right. Okay, that's right. So I've got it now. Okay, so Hild came out in 2013, and if I'm remembering right, and I think your next book came in 2018, a very different kind of book, So Lucky. So, I don't know how you'd characterize it. To me, it ended up feeling a little like a thriller. Is that fair?
My agent describes it as a thriller of the body.
Yeah, I
have no idea really what that means.
Well, it has a little bit of maybe body horror to it in some sense, and kind of exploring the boundaries of like what that means as a genre. It's not a book I expected from you, right? In terms of, it is fast-paced and it is tense and it's tonally so different from Hild.
Very different. It's the only book I have ever written that's about an issue. Most of the other things I do the focalized heterotopia, so whether we're talking about disability or queerness or being a woman, my main characters, they're in those senses, it's a heterotopia. So Lucky is actually about what it is like to be disabled. So in that sense, it's really different to all my other work.
And she becomes disabled at the start of the book and is struggling with that, right? So this isn't someone who has lived with it for many years and is
brand new.
Right. And so so your protagonist there, I believe she's like, at the beginning of the book, she's married, she's heading a large AIDS organization, she has stable work, stable life, stable health, and then she's diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And fairly quickly in the book, her life falls apart. Her wife leaves her, I think, and she leaves her work, and but then there's also these threats, there seems to be this looming violence at the same time that she's dealing with her own body. So maybe if you could just talk a little about what you were kind of trying to do with this, if that makes sense.
This book is not about me. It's not an autobiography anyway, and yet there are many parallels. So I used to teach women's self-defense, study martial arts. I was very physically competent. And when I got MS and gradually started to lose my physical competence, two things happened. One, I realized how vulnerable, I felt vulnerable for the first time in my whole life. And that was really scary. And it was really brought home to me one day. I was really tired and I was just turned on the TV in the days when people watch TV. And it was CNN, and they were doing this story about a guy, and I forget which state, in a wheelchair who had been tortured to death in his own home by two men. And that stuck in my head for years. And then the second thing that happened to me when I started to become impaired was realizing just how badly treated Crips are, and also, more to the point, how badly I regarded myself.
Oh, interesting.
I had this massive amount of internalized ableism, really a huge amount, in a way that I've never been sexist or homophobic. I never had a problem being a woman or being queer, but I had a problem being disabled. I didn't dive into it and accept the identity. I'm like, oh, this sucks. If there had been a cure, I'd be like, bang, I would do that.
It's not a parallel, it's not the same thing at all, but I had cancer and I'm fine now, but I went through chemo and surgery and radiation. And towards the tail end of chemo, I at one point I tried to walk down the street, like go for a walk around the block with my husband, and had to turn back after half a block because I didn't think I could make it all the way. I had a really hard time accepting help. I had a really hard time admitting that I had limits, that my body just was not capable and might not be capable for some time of doing things. And of course there's so much uncertainty, you know, you have some sense that chemo will end and you should get your capabilities back, but then there's the surgery and the radiation, and there's just a lot you don't know when you're going through the process. And of course, always the chance that it might come back. And so, I don't know, I guess I don't know whether that seems similar to you, but it was interesting to me because if any of my friends had been going through cancer treatment, I would have absolutely been wanting to help them and wanting them to accept that help, and frustrated if they didn't want to accept help. And so it was a little jarring to be in this position where I knew intellectually that it was fine to let people help me, and yet I really didn't want to, and I was very angry about it. Right?
I had no problem accepting help. The problem I had was being perceived as a poor, sad little cripple. And that was because of my own internalized ableism. I used to look at people with canes or crutches or in a wheelchair and think, oh, their life must be so horrible. And so I thought people were looking at me that way. And in fact, many of them were, because most of the world is quite ableist. And I really wanted to talk about that in So Lucky. And I also didn't want the main character, Mara's distress, to be directed inwards. And so that's why I made the metaphor really concrete. I put the stress and fear outside her, and that's where the whole thriller plot comes from.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I can see that. So yeah, because it is this sort of this parallel structure, right, where she is experiencing these things. We're very, very close to her in her experience and her frustrations and anger, and then at the same time there's this external threat and thriller plot, which we don't know how seriously to take it either, right? And I think as readers, I thought that was very interesting, that I was unclear, like, is she actually in danger? And it just put us in a place of uncertainty that is similar to, I think, you know, sort of like, or at least echoing a lot of the uncertainty she would have been feeling.
That's absolutely it. I mean, she was afraid.
Yeah.
And so she needed something specific to be afraid about. But really, she was just afraid of becoming less and less able and needing more and more help. And of course, I was certainly afraid when I heard that CNN story. I thought, wow, yeah, people really do single out the vulnerable people. I used to teach women's self-defense, and one of the things I taught was how not to walk as though you feel vulnerable.
Right.
Because there are so many studies showing that how predators work this way. They look, well, it's just like a lion, right? Or a lioness, because the lions never actually bother to hunt. It's just like a lion going after a herd of antelope. They don't go for the biggest, they go for the little one. Right. Pick off the weak first. And so Mara immediately assumed she would be targeted as a group, and that's where all that came from. Yeah,
I have a 14-year-old daughter right now, and I was talking to her about self-defense classes, and we were thinking about taking some this summer, and then I just learned that our high school, all of the sophomores get self-defense classes as part of PE, cool. Which is terrific. So that's coming, which is great. But it's one of those things where I've never taken a class, but you said that you didn't feel afraid or vulnerable, right, before MS, and I also, like, in my head, I think I'm 6 feet tall, you know, like, so I walk alone in the city at night, and sometimes I'll be on, our local mom's mailing list, and people will be saying, oh, do you think it's safe for me to take the train at 9 p.m. Into the city? And it's so interesting to me because it would not have occurred to me that it might be an issue, right? And so, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm going for here. I guess there's an interesting intersection of sort of gender concerns around vulnerability, safety, strength, capability, and how that intersects with disability, perhaps, right? Did it feel very challenging to work so much with material from your own life as compared to the earlier books? I was just talking yesterday with one of the other writers here. We're at ICFA, an academic conference in Florida at the moment, and she was saying that as much as sometimes it can be valuable to write from your own experience, and we have certainly a big press in publishing right now for more own voices representation, which is, I think, a good thing. There's also a way in which you shouldn't feel obliged to write about your own experience, right?
You should not feel obliged to monetize your own trauma.
Right, that's a great way of putting it, right? So, so when you came to writing this book about MS and taking it on so directly, maybe if you could talk a little bit, just like what led you to that.
I really didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I really didn't want to do it. But it wouldn't go away. It was one of those... Okay, let me explain. I'd written Hild, it was out, and I spent a whole year touring with Hild. I did a hardcover tour in the US. I did a hardcover tour in the UK. And then when I got back from that, I did a paperback tour. I mean, I was exhausted. And I had already started the next Hild book. I'd started Meanwood. And I was just really tired. I was not... And so one of my classic behaviors is avoidance behavior, right? It's like, here's this big thing I should be working on. Let's do something else.
Right.
And so I started a PhD.
I didn't know that.
And I got halfway through that and I thought, you know, I need to avoid this too. And so I wrote So Lucky. And then I went back to the PhD and then I went back to me. So it was like this nested avoidance behavior.
My general feeling when I don't know what to do with my life is to go back to school and collect another degree. And sometimes in the middle of a degree program, like I was doing my PhD and partway through was trying to write this book and I thought, I just don't know enough Sri Lankan history or politics. I should go get an MA in political history and then I'll be able to write this book properly. So I managed to not do that, but it was...
Yeah, I mean, I have never actually, I didn't have a degree of any kind.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no bachelor's, no master's, nothing.
I'm laughing only because Nicola is so brilliant. It's startling to me. So I just want like my university to hand you a couple honorary degrees at this point.
So basically I did a PhD by published work. So I went from no qualifications whatsoever to a PhD in 1 year.
Wow.
And I had to learn so much. But it was great. And it was just the perfect removal from Meanwood for a while. But actually doing the PhD is what made it possible for me to write So Lucky, because it was doing the PhD that taught me how I work, what I write. And I had been avoiding writing this story, this MS ableism story, for a long time because I did not, I couldn't figure out why it felt so hinky to me. I'm just like, that's not what I do. I can't do that. And doing the PhD taught me what I actually do in my work, generally speaking. And so then I understood what the problem with So Lucky was. It was actually dealing with disability, which made everything very, very clear. It's like, okay, you need to write this story. People need to understand how ableism works. And I just can't avoid it anymore. But now at least I understand why it's going to be so hard for me. Why it's going to be not like anything else I've ever done, and not like anything I will ever do again. I'm never going to write a book like that again. It was just, I had to get out.
so interesting. There's a, I went to, I think it was MLA, the Modern Language Association conference 2 decades ago. I was a little baby writer, and went to a panel on South Asian literature, and so I was attending the panel, and all the panelists were up there, and they were talking about tropes in South Asian diaspora literature, and one of them said, well, you just have to write your arranged marriage book at some point and get it out of your system. Until you write it, it's just gonna keep poking at you, so just write it, and then you can write, and then you can write all the other books. Which is pretty much what I did with Bodies in Motion. So, and it did clear the way. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about the new book. Now, you keep referring to it as a different name than the one that so you're saying Meanwood?
Meanwood is the second Hild book.
Okay. And the book that's come out now, Spear, is not part of that trilogy?
No, completely different.
I misunderstood.
Completely different thing.
Okay, so yes, because I knew that Hild was supposed to be the first book of a trilogy. So Meanwood, we're going to then continue St. Hilda's story.
Yes.
Okay, and Spear is someone else entirely. I looked at it, I've pre-ordered, but I don't have it yet. So in a few weeks, it will come to me. But, and I was reading the description, I was like, this doesn't sound like Hild. Okay, it's a different character. So maybe just tell us a little, what's this book about, and what's exciting to you?
Spear is set in 6th century Wales.
Okay.
It's about a young girl who's raised in a cave by her mother, who is traumatized and hiding. And the girl is nameless for a very long time. And eventually she gets her name from her mother, because her mother has not named her, because, as the mother says, naming calls, and she has very good reason to be hiding. But she finally gives in and gives the name to this girl, and the name is Berhuthir, which means hard spear or spear enduring, but which becomes Peritir, who, of course, it's spelt Peritur, but it's pronounced Peritir. And that's basically the beginning of what is now usually known as the Percival stories, Sir Percival.
Okay.
So Peritur in my story is a woman, girl then a woman. And so it's essentially a queer Arthurian retelling. And I have loved the matter of Britain since I could read.
Me too.
And I never ever wanted to write one, because it's a national origin story, and so inevitably it's bound up with all those difficult manifest destiny, nationalist,
right,
crap, all that stuff. And it's always about straight, white, able-bodied, rich men. And but I love the idea of Camelot, because it was always meant to be where people fought for justice and truth and a better world. And I wish Camelot had existed, but more to the point, I wish it had people like me in it. And so I just thought, well, fuck this. I'm going to put people like me in it.
That's right.
And so in my Camelot, there are people of color, disabled people, women people, queer people, polyamorous people.
Nice.
You know, and I cover the Grail legend, the Percival story, the Merlin Nimue story, and the Arthur Guinevere Lancelot story, all in 45,000 words.
I know, it's a slim book, and that's a lot
I mean,
that you've packed
it was actually
in.
meant to be a short story.
Oh yeah.
And then it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. So,
well, I'm thrilled. I love the Arthurian stories. I at one point thought about becoming an Arthurian scholar, and have always loved them. And I love seeing the changes that happen. I wrote a paper at one point about Guinevere through the ages, and I was looking at how she's depicted by Mallory, then by Tennyson. Tennyson makes me crazy. There's this whole scene where she's in the convent at the end and Arthur comes to visit her and she made her face a darkness from her lord. She's like down on the ground with her hair spread out. And I was like, this is not my Guinevere. This is not, and my Arthur would not let her do this either. This is, so, and then eventually we get to T.H. White, who I love his take on the three of them. And actually Guy Gabriel Kay and what he does with Fiona Bar was very healing for me.
I haven't actually read that.
Oh yeah, it's lovely. It's just lovely.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. The Fiona Bar Tapestry is one of Kay's earliest works. It's a trilogy. It's not as, I would say, probably as polished as some of his later work, but it starts with 5 college students from our world going to this fantasy world, but one of them, it turns out, is Guinevere reborn, and later in the trilogy, Arthur is woken and called to the battle, and they also raise Lancelot, and it's heartbreaking initially, and then he gives them such a lovely ending. Okay, I don't want to spoil it, but it's...
So I will tell you that Spear has a great ending.
Yay!
There is no one that we really care for has a bad time. It's lots of people die.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about Percival, I realize. Is he the one with the questing beast? No, that's one of the other knights?
I think so. I mean, it depends which version you're talking about.
Okay.
But no, essentially you don't need to know a thing about Arthurian literature for this book. And in fact, I would say many people will get 2/3 of the way through it before they realize. Because it feels more like, it feels a bit more like Hild. In that way. It immerses you in the world of 6th century Wales.
So, well, I think given that, maybe my last question for you, I could talk to you forever, but I'm going to let you go and pack soon. But I'd love for you to talk a little about how you did the historical research for both Hild and Spear. We have a lot of young writers or newer writers who are likely to be watching this, and I'm not sure I would know where to start with that kind of research, so if you could...
I worked my way back through historiography, and by that what I mean is, when I was trying to find out about Hild, all I could find were a couple of little tourist pamphlets at the Abbey ruin. And I was like, this is great, now I want to go find the book. I need to find, for example, a novel about Hild. There aren't any. I thought, well, I need to find a biography. There wasn't one. So I thought, well, I don't even really know much about that time. So then I got an old English history book. It's a pretty famous one, written in, I don't know if it was written in 1944, but it was published in 1944. So it was very behind the academic research, but it was a beginning. It was kind of like starting with Wikipedia in that way. You get the summary. And I read it, and there really wasn't very much about Hild's era. Really not much at all. Mostly because in that time, very few people were literate. And certainly not in that part of Britain. And so then I went to the only source we have for Hild, and that is Bede. And he has 5 pages total in big letters, lots of white space, about Hild. And almost all of that is hagiography. So it's just all bullshit. All we know, actually all we think we know about Hild is that she was the daughter of Hererich, Emperor Guzwith, that she was baptized when she was 13 and joined the church when she was 33 and died when she was 66. Her sister was called compare us with, and that is all we know. We know nothing else.
Right. I think that question of hagiography is interesting me in part. So when I was trying to do research for some of my own work set in Sri Lanka, I read this book, an essay in The Presence of the Past, and I'm going to blank on all the titles now because this was back in 2002 or something like that I read it. But the book it was in was The Presence of the Past. The essay was talking about how in Sri Lanka we have close to 2,000 years of recorded quote-unquote history, right? But it's recorded by these Buddhist monks, and so not only is it biased in the way that anything might generally be biased by people's perceptions, but also they were often warring, like they were fighting for control of different sects were fighting for control and power, and so as another group came to power, they would rewrite the history, quote unquote history, and that happened over and over and over again. So I might say that in the 5th century, this particular king, managed to conquer all of the Tamil small kings around and rule the entire island. And that might be true, that might not be true. It was certainly a story that would have served the monks of that era and possibly the monks that follow, and it becomes so difficult to parse it out. And yet, and this goes a little to what you were saying, I guess, about the matter of Britain and Arthurian sort of nationalisms and how it supports that in Sri Lanka. This history gets used in service of Sinhala nationalism, right? And is part of what fuels tensions during the conflict, etc. And so it's tricky material to work with in that sense. I maybe with 7th century you didn't have quite the same issues, but
well, the biggest issue is that what we did have was written by a monk trained in the whole classics tradition, and of course women's place in tradition, and certainly especially early Christianity was still very Greek and Jewish influence, and there are many gender issues.
Yeah. I was working on a video game set at Sigiriya in the 5th century Sri Lanka, and there are still these frescoes on the wall that I've gone to see of these temple maidens, or royal maidens, the king's concubines presumably, but they're bare-breasted, and so the monks have destroyed most of them, earlier monks, and the ones that remain were the ones that were very hard to reach without risking life and limb back in the day, and so it's tremendously frustrating, and you're trying to get a sense of what were these women's lives like, how much power might they have had, and your cues are in the clothes they wear, in the jewelry they wear, in the way they're represented, and the positions that they may be in, whether they have servants, etc. And much of that has just been wiped away, and we don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's the problem, and we just have no information. And so, going back to the research question, I worked my way through. I started with something written in the 40s. And then in the bibliography, I would find other things, and then I would go look at the rest of those people's works. So I traced through footnotes and bibliographies and gradually worked my way up to very recent scholarship. And then, even better, I discovered early career researchers' blogs. And then I was dealing with the people who were actually doing new stuff. And so you could pose questions on blogs, right? And so they didn't know me from Eve, and so I was just like, maybe they thought I was a professor or something, I don't know. And I would just ask a question and they would take it seriously. Or actually, most often, they were so terrified of actually committing an opinion that they would say, we don't know that. And so I actually started to develop little tricks. So for example, there was one point where I wanted to know what 7th century English people thought and felt and how they dealt with dogs. And so I said, so dogs, and they're like, we don't know, we have no idea. I said, okay. So, you know, if Hild had a Pekingese, they're like, no, there were no Pekingese. I'm like, see, you do know something. So what else do you know? And eventually, you know, we would get talking and they would just be guessing, and I was fine with that. I just wanted informed guesses.
That's right.
And then eventually I started to disagree with them and say, oh no, it would not have gone this way. Here's how it would have gone. I worked it out.
Right. Oh, that sounds great.
So we had great, you know, I would go to places and have a pint with someone I would go to a convention, or I'd go visit my family in the UK. And I would know some medievalist close by, and we'd go to the pub and have a pint and we'd just talk, because they were much more willing to risk opinion when it was not visible to anybody else.
Of course, right, especially if they're early career and, you know, it's they're concerned about reputation and so on, and it's always a little nerve-wracking saying, even when I talk about Sri Lankan history material on here, I keep wanting to, like, wait, let me pause and go check my citations and make sure I'm giving you the right details. So,
but I ended up basically doing original research.
Yeah.
Like certainly for Meanwood, one of the things I've spent a lot of time on is solving battles. There are certain battles that occur in a couple of years in the 630s that make no sense. It's like that shouldn't have happened. So how and why did it happen?
Oh, that's interesting.
So I went and researched the topography and the weapons, and then I worked out how it happened and why it was called that and why it went that way. I mean, obviously I'll never publish any of that except in the story of the novel, because I'm not a historian. But I think in a different life I could have.
You could have been.
Yeah, I really enjoy it.
You can always, you know, give your notes to somebody who's working on it, and they might incorporate it. So you might give them a little bit of a jump start on something. So, or collaborate, you know, co-author something. So, all right. Well, I've kept you my allotted 45 minutes. This was so wonderful, Nicola. I feel it was such a privilege to be your student, and yeah, if I could.
I'm really glad. I'm really glad. I don't do a lot of teaching anymore. I mean, I would if I was asked to but I don't like. Not really a fan of Zoom teaching. I sometimes have a bit of a hard time with screens.
It's challenging.
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, I especially love it when I have actually managed to help somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the joy of it.
Well, we're hoping to start doing in-person workshops in Chicago again soon. We did a few pre-pandemic, and possibly eventually work towards a 6-week Clarion style thing in Chicago. We'll see. That's a few years out, if so. But we would love to have you come teach there. So, well, if it happens, we will be in touch. So. Okay. Thanks again. This was Marianne Monraj interviewing Nicola Griffith, author of many books, most recently Spear, coming out in April 2022. We also talked about Hild and So Lucky, so I recommend you go out and get them all. Thank you.
Thank you.